Hello and welcome to this week's talk about Ireland. So this is about Ireland colonialism and terrorism and how we might understand the relationships between the three of them in understanding the conflict in Ireland in general and indeed, of course, the entire history of the conflict. Now, normally when I would do this, I would have in a lecture, I would have a pause and ask you a question to discuss in pairs, but since you're probably not in pairs, what I suggest that you do when we go to the next slide is you just pause and you can write down some notes yourself on the answer to the question. I think that might be a helpful thing to do, and then you can look back at them and you've listened to the rest of the material. Okay. The question is this: is the conflict in Northern Ireland fundamentally about religious divisions between Protestants and Roman Catholics? Is it a religious conflict? And you can see the relevance of this question, I guess, to the kind of questions that there are today about the role of religion in political violence, and particularly in relation to Islam. But also, I'd like you to think about it in terms of the question of colonialism. So is it a question that the conflict in Northern Ireland was fundamentally about religious divisions, or was there some other way in which you could think about the conflict? So I'll ask you to pause now, having just started, and write down for a couple of minutes just a note or two on what you think, what your impression is. I know many of you will think that you don't know anything at all about Ireland. I'm pretty sure you will know more than you think, but in any case, just write down whatever comes to your mind. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to share what you've written. Just do that, and then we can come back to it later. Okay? I'm going to pause for a second. Right. So, welcome back. We've done a little bit of notes there, and I'm going to go on to talk about the first part of this presentation, which is about the question of who's to blame, but also the question of the history of Ireland and the relationship between Ireland and Britain. Okay, now here's a quote which I see has been cut off from the presentation, but you'll see it in the PowerPoint when you download it and have a look yourself, which is a summary from a kind of mainstream political scientist, two political scientists, talking about the different ways in which the conflict is held to be meaningful. So it's either fundamentally theological, cultural, economic, or ethnic. Some say it's caused by the Irish Republic, some by the Catholic Church, others by the political culture of Irish nationalism, and various permutations hold all three of these to be causal agents. Then, of course, there are some who say that the British state, or British imperialism in Ireland, or British colonial settlement in Ireland, or the Protestant religion, or some permutation of these causal agents are responsible. Finally, some argue for a plague in all houses of Britain, Ireland, and Northern Ireland, holding all the peoples of these islands, or their religions, or economies, or institutions culpable. Okay. Now, that's a range of explanations where you can't really agree with all of them. You've got to kind of choose between some of them. You have some combinations, but you've got to choose between some of them. So there are kind of external explanations. That is, explanations which relate to factors outside Ireland, the British state, colonialism, and the partition of the island into two, which we'll come back to, or the British state and the neglect of Northern Ireland, the failure of the British state to deal with the problems that there were in Northern Ireland in the period between 1921 and 1969, which we'll come back to again, or the Irish state, that the problem of Northern Ireland was a problem, but the Irish state wanted to unite Ireland, and that caused the conflict in the north. Then, of course, there are internal explanations, that it was religion, that there were cultural differences, that there were socioeconomic inequalities. And of course, all of these factors are true, that these things are factors in the society. But just to query this kind of definition a little bit, it's not really very clear to me that the factors of religion, cultural difference, or even socioeconomic inequalities are unrelated to the external explanations, that is, to do with colonialism or indeed with Irish nationalism. I mean, all of these things are interrelated with each other. And so if you said that religion was a part of the explanation, well, you'd have to look at the question of how religion related to the interests and activities of the British state, for example. Now, I want to introduce you to the concept of settler colonialism. This is a concept where it's not just that a country's military or administrative structure takes over a country, like in India, for example, in the Raj, but that large numbers of people go and settle and live in the new country and effectively take it over. And you can see this map shows, it's a map done by Palestine Solidarity activists, but you can see the map shows in the darker colour settler colonies which have decolonized, and we can question that in particular in relation to Northern Ireland, because it's not very clear that that's happened in Northern Ireland. But let's look at the ones there. The most obvious one that you will know about, I guess, as a settler colony probably is South Africa, and then Algeria. And some of you will have watched the Battle of Algiers, which is about the struggle to remove the settler colonists from France, from Algeria. And so in the case of settler colonialism, the aim of the settlers is to control the resources of the territory. And in the case of South Africa and apartheid, the white settlers wanted to control the entire country of South Africa, exploit its wealth. And that was the process of ending that settler colonial domination involved armed struggle or political violence or terrorism, however you describe it. And it led then in the end to a process of decolonization. It doesn't mean that the settlers had to leave. Many of the settlers or descendants of the settlers are still there. But then if you look at the other examples, the ones in red, which perhaps you wouldn't be so familiar with as settler colonies, in particular, let me just focus on the most obvious ones as far as people living in Britain are concerned, the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And of course, all of these were, at one time or another, British colonies. But what happened was that settlers went there, sometimes from this country, sometimes from other countries. In the case of the USA, a lot of different countries went there. And the settlers took over the countries. And they remain, in the case of the USA and Canada, in charge of those countries. As you know, the native population of the USA, and to not quite the same extent that Canada, was effectively slaughtered. There was a kind of a genocidal process of trying to effectively eliminate the native populations. Same was true, although in slightly different ways, in New Zealand and Australia. And of course, those two countries also are run by the descendants of the settlers, the white settlers, to this day. There has been no decolonization, and the reason for that largely is that the natives have been almost entirely exterminated. So that's settler colonialism. That's a kind of colonialism which is distinct from colonialism which involves simply the occupation or administration of a foreign territory, and it has a specific form which results in a long-running dispute between the settlers and the natives, unless, of course, the natives can be eliminated. And this is from one of the essential readings from this week, from Pamela Clayton's chapter in a book which I edited some time ago, which I think you should definitely have a look at. Northern Ireland is not, she says, an example of religious conflict, although of course there are doctrinal differences in that case. It's perfectly reasonable to analyse Northern Ireland as a plural society with one dominant and one subordinate ethnic group. To this day, Protestants dominant, Catholics subordinate. It's wholly inadequate to subtract that from its historical and global context. The parallels with settler societies illuminate the picture, although it is not claimed here that Northern Ireland's history as a settler colony explains the whole situation, but no explanation which ignores this fact can be complete. So, Pamela is saying there, the Northern Ireland is a settler colony, essentially, that many features of the conflict in Northern Ireland can be explained by the fact that this was a settler colony, which the history of which we'll discuss shortly. And here we go to the history. I mean, this is way back. I mean, Ireland became a colony of what was then England, I suppose, in the 12th century. There was much renewed involvement in colonising Ireland in the time of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell, of course, as you'll know from your history lessons, a progressive in British terms, but in terms of his relationship with Ireland, very much an imperialist. For the next 10 years after the Cromwellian invasion, a third of the Irish population was killed or died of starvation. I'm going to sort of race through some of these slides, and I just want you to kind of look. I mean, you feel free to read the full text as you go back through them, but also I want to show you some of the images. So, you know, the policy was to crush Catholics. Cromwell dispossessed the land-owning Irish Catholics, shared the land amongst his soldiers and financiers, transferred the lands essentially from Catholics to Protestants within a very short period of time. And there's Cromwell's bombardment, one of the famous pictures of the time. And here is a primary source in Ireland about the killing of Catholics, the killing of the Irish. I don't want to read all of this out. I mean, it's rather gruesome, but you can see at the end they go for this friar, a monk, whom the soldiers took and made an end of. Another was taken to the Round Tower under the repute of lieutenant, where he understood that the officers in the tower yet had no quarter. He confessed he was a friar, but that did not save him. So, you know, this is a brutal invasion and occupation and expropriation. The land was expropriated and expelled. And there's the effect from 1641 to 1703, that's the space of 50 years, where the majority of the land went from ownership of Catholics to ownership of Protestants by 1703. And there's a more detailed map where you can see that process happening between 1641 and 1703. Again, you can see in particular the transfer of land in the south of Ireland, what mostly became the Republic of Ireland. And we go to 1690. Part of this process, the Battle of the Boyne, the famous battle for Ulster Loyalists and Ulster Unionists, the moment where they decisively beat the Catholics in their mythology. And today we have murals to Cromwell in Belfast, remembering the slaughter of Catholics in colonial invasions and occupations. To this day, commemorated on the walls in Protestant areas of Belfast. And here's the slogan, just a close-up from the previous slide. You can see it was in the bottom left corner. Catholicism is more than a religion. It's a political power. Therefore, I'm led to believe that there will be no peace in Ireland until the Catholic Church is crushed. Now, as well as being chilling, I invite you to see the parallels between that conception of Catholics and the contemporary conception of Muslims in the War on Terror. The idea that Islam is not just a religion, it's a political power, and that is the problem with Muslims is not just the fact that they have particular politics, but that they are Muslims. itself, and that Islam needs to be crushed is the kind of implication. So I'd invite you to see the parallels. I mean, that seems to me is a very telling parallel from then to now. After the Treaty of Limerick, after the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, we have a series of laws ruling that Catholics could neither teach nor send their children abroad. They couldn't enter into mixed marriages if they had property. Catholic property was inherited equally amongst sons unless one was a Protestant, in which case he received it all, etc., etc., etc. A series of laws to ensure Protestant domination of the country. And the poor become, as a result of these laws, increasingly homeless, no homes to live in, they couldn't afford to pay rent, they were evicted, and it did little good for them to try and defend their homes. Their homes would be razed to the ground, roofs torn off by the landlords who sought to bring in livestock in replacement. That's a practice which happened elsewhere, of course, famously in the Highland clearances in Scotland, but this is in a colonial context, which makes it, to some extent at least, different. So if you go to some of the country museums in Ireland, you'll see representations of these sort of houses in the bog, constructed out of whatever was around at the time, the wreck of previous homes destroyed by landlords, etc. Again, I'm not going to go through the text, but feel free to read much more about this. And there's the destination of overseas immigrants. It doesn't count the immigrants who went to the UK. But you can see the massive peak in immigrants, thousands of people, that is. So it's 200,000 up to 1,200,000 in 1840 to 1850. You can see the peak there in blue. And, to America. Over 1 million people in 1 year alone, according to that data, to America as a result of the famine, which we'll talk about. The famine came in the late 1840s. By the end of the famine, population dropped by at least 2.5 million people who were forced out into coffin ships, they were known as, into exile. Many of their descendants, of course, still live in America or Canada. Education was seen as a means of escaping poverty, and that's partly one of the reasons why education is seen so important in Irish culture. And of course, what happened as a result of all this was that people were defeated, beaten, and dead, but the ones who remained resisted. And this is a long process from the 1840s to this period of 1916, 1920. But here's Ken Loach's film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which you should all watch, with Cillian Murphy in the title role, in the lead role, sorry. A film about what happened when people took up arms against the British presence, British colonisation of Ireland. A moment happens in 1916 with the Easter Rising. We'll talk about that a lot more. A moment which remains a historical touchstone for politics in Northern Ireland today. And they are from 2007. Who dares to speak of Easter week? A mural to the 1916 Rising with the figures of the signatories to the proclamation of the Republic, including Edinburgh's James Connolly, of course, and you see the significance of that for today's politics. This is the gable end wall in Belfast in 2007. These murals have not gone away. These sentiments have not gone away. And you see here also, this is a demonstration, one of the regular annual demonstrations to commemorate the introduction of internment, Easter, the Easter Rising, to commemorate the deaths in Bloody Sunday in 1972. And you can see there in the big banner in the middle, the Countess Markievicz Cummin, which means the local branch of Sinn Féin, which is named after Countess Markievicz, who fought in the Easter Rising and is a revered figure to this day. And here we have the path to the Rising, the Irish Citizen Army created by the Edinburgh raised trade unionist and socialist James Connolly. And after the outbreak of World War I, the Irish Citizen Army and another organisation, the Irish Volunteers, joined together to start planning the Easter Rising in 1916. And this, of course, is the creation of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, as it's known today. And here, of course, roll a mural from some time ago, from the 1980s, I think. The role of Cumann na mBan, the women's section of the IRA, commemorated in Belfast. In a number of places, the women of 1916, women armed, involved in the revolution. And here's the proclamation, famous proclamation of the Irish Republic to the people of Ireland. This is a year before the Bolshevik Revolution and in the middle of the First World War. And you can see it's signed there at the bottom by Thomas Clarke, Sean McDermott, Thomas MacDonagh, Joseph Plunkett, James Connolly, and Eamon Cant, and Patrick Pearse, perhaps the best known of the signatories. And the Rising, of course, goes wrong. The arms being sent to support the Rising are intercepted by the British, and it's put down over a number of days. The Rising starts at the General Post Office in the centre of Dublin, which is held for some days, which you can see in some of the graphic representations of the Rising in film, for example. And it's put down. And the British response is to put the Rising down. 450 people killed, 2,500 injured, 9 missing, almost all in Dublin. The Commander-in-Chief of Britain, Sir John Maxwell, caused 16 of the Irish to be court-martialed and shot. And it was the execution of these men which really led, in the end, to the battle which commenced afterwards. More than 3,000 people were arrested, 90 people were sentenced to death. The 15 who'd signed the proclamation, the people who I just mentioned, were killed by firing squad. They were shown no mercy. They were tried in secret in military courts, sentenced to death. The deaths were only publicly announced after their executions. And it was that which turned public opinion against the British. When it became known that James Connolly had been tied to a chair and shot because he was so badly wounded, there was widespread revulsion throughout Ireland. Markievicz, Countess Markievicz, who we mentioned already, was sentenced to death, but she escaped because she was a woman. They wouldn't execute a woman. And she escaped to fight another day. There's Kilmainham. It's now a museum there, which you can go to if you ever go to Dublin. You should. Interesting place to go and visit, and you can see a lot of material about the Rising and the subsequent War of Independence. And of course, we come now to 1921, to the War of Independence. What happened was that in 1918, in the British general election, which also occurred in Ireland because Ireland was a colony of Britain, in the British general election of 1918, Sinn Féin won an overall majority of the seats, and they set up as a result a parliament, the Dáil, first of and the parliament was not recognised by the British, and they suppressed the parliament, even although, of course, a majority of the population had voted for Sinn Féin, overwhelming majority in terms of seats. And so the Irish took up arms under the leadership of Michael Collins, famously portrayed here by Liam Neeson in the film of the same name. Again, well worth having a look at this. There's lots of material if you're interested in Irish politics. It should be good to have a look at to learn more.